There's only one proper way to write comments in Python, and it is this: the pound sign. Whether you are writing a single line of comment or multi-lines of comments, this is the only proper way to write comments in Python. But before going any further, why would you write comments in Python? Well, people write comments for two reasons. Number one reason is to make your code more explainable. Usually, as you're writing code, you already want to aim for making your code explainable by choosing the appropriate names for your variables and your functions, as well as your classes and methods as well. But there will be many times where things are not as obvious and you'll need to make some comments for either for your future self or for other people you work with, and using comments make your code more easily understandable. The second reason why would you write comments is basically to be able to experiment with your code more easily and flexibly. So whenever you're experimenting with code and you want to see how is your overall program going to be affected if you remove some line of code, so maybe you can make it shorter, faster, or experiment with different versions, rather than completely deleting something, you can just add the pound sign right before it and it will turn into a comment. So if you're happy with it, if you're happy with the code, you can directly delete that code. Or if you think that line might be actually good and you want to experiment with another line, you can immediately do that as well by commenting out another line of code compared to the first one and see which one works better for you. This is not for large amounts of code, but more of a small couple lines where you can try and experiment faster with. Rather than deleting the whole thing and rewriting it, you can simply add a pound sign and it will be ignored by Python. So these were the two major reasons why people write comments in their code. And adding a pound sign is the only proper way to add comments to your code. And one thing you should know is that comments doesn't have to take whole lines, and it's perfectly okay to comment your code right next to your code as well, and that can be highly useful as well. Another way you might see people writing comments is basically with triple quotes. But this is actually not a proper way to comment your code, because the proper way to use the triple quotes are for something called docstring, which is a string that explains a documentation. So these triple quotes are not only useful in a single line, but they're actually useful in multiple lines. And because they're useful in multiple lines, you can see people commenting out large sections of code compared to single lines. And this can work out fine, but it's not actually the proper way to use it. So when Python says these, it will say, well, that's a comment, that's a comment. But when Python says this, it will try to assign it to a string, but because it cannot assign it, it will ignore it and continue with the rest of the code. So these will serve as a multi-line comment. But it is not recommended. Maybe you can use it for experimental purposes as well, when you're trying larger chunks of code. But there are better ways to do that, such as with notebooks, like Jupyter notebooks, or other ways to section your code, such as with notebook cells. You can run them individually and test them, but it is not recommended to use triple quotes as comments. But in case you see it, and you'll probably see it, don't get surprised. These triple quotes are actually intended for documentation purposes. So when you write a function, a class, or method, you might want to give them some documentation. So if someone else sees your code, or when your future self sees this code, you'll know what this function is doing in this case. And we can define that using triple quotes. So because I wrote a docstring here, which is a documentation string, whenever I write this function, I will have some information on this and it will be displayed under this function. And this can be helpful for me in the future, and I won't have to go to the original code where I write this function, but I will be able to see the explanation of what this function does from the simple explanation that I previously wrote. So another way you could section off your code or give more explanation on your code would be actually using a notebook environment like Jupyter or Google Colab, which allows you to write code cells or text cells. So you can have some sectioning or explanation functionality other than writing pure code. And this uses a language called Markdown, and it can serve you as some kind of commenting on more larger blocks of your code. And to make these lines bigger, you can also add a pound sign here to make your code more clear and understandable. But again, this is not embedded in Python, but it's a feature of this notebook environment, which is Colab in this case, or it can be a Jupyter notebook, which are kinda almost the same thing. because Colab is essentially a Jupyter notebook hosted by Google. So this is basically everything I want to show you about commenting in Python, the proper way to do it, other ways you might see it, and what they're meant for, as well as the two main reasons why people write comments in their codes and why you should too. So if you think I missed something, or if there's a concept you want me to explain about Python or machine learning, you can leave that in the comments below as well. So I hope you learned something, you got some value out of this video. If you don't want to miss out on future Python tutorials as well as machine learning tutorials, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.